Let's turn today to Mark's Gospel, chapter 9 and verse 9. We were considering in our last study how Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to the Mount of Transfiguration and was transfigured before them. And then, as they were coming down from the mountain, we read here in verse 9, He gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man should rise from the dead. It's very interesting to see the attitude that Jesus had towards publicity. He did not want people to be attracted to Him either by His supernatural ability to heal the sick or by such supernatural revelations as we read of here when He was transfigured. The only thing that He proclaimed publicly was His message of freedom from sin and purity and holiness and fellowship with God. And He wanted people to be attracted to Him through that message. And this is why He constantly told people, in many cases when He had healed them, not to tell anyone. And the same thing here to the disciples. And this has got a lesson for us today also. When we seek to draw people to the church through supernatural manifestations, they may not really be interested in God or in fellowship with Him or in a holy life. They may be only interested in the excitement that the flesh gets through experiencing something supernatural. We are to be careful that we are to draw people to the Lord who really desire to be free from sin and to live a holy life. And of course, when He spoke about rising from the dead, we read here in verse 10, the disciples seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead might mean. They didn't even know what rising from the dead meant because they had never heard of anyone coming out alive from the grave and living forever. And they began questioning Him, saying, Why is it that the scribes say that first Elijah must come? That was a quotation from the book of Malachi in the last chapter. And Jesus said to them, verse 12, Elijah does first come and restore everything. And yet how is it written of the Son of Man that He should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? He drew their attention back to the cross, not to the transfiguration, where His glory was seen, but to His suffering and being treated with contempt, as it were telling them that that is what they needed to understand more than anything else, what the sufferings of Christ mean. That is not attractive to the flesh. And yet the spiritual man becomes spiritual and has become spiritual only through understanding the sufferings of Christ. It is through sufferings that Jesus went to glory, and we need to understand fellowship with His sufferings before we can understand fellowship with Him in glory. And then Jesus explained, But I say to you that Elijah has indeed come. And they did to him whatever they wished, just as it is written of him. And that was a reference to John the Baptist. John the Baptist had come in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And the people had not, the Pharisees anyway, had not accepted his message, and Herod, we know, had chopped off his head. They did to him whatever they wished. John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus Christ. It also refers to a time in the future when there will be a ministry on earth, not necessarily only through one individual, but through the corporate testimony of the church, which is going to be in the spirit of Elijah and in the spirit of John the Baptist. And that will be the complete fulfillment of Malachi 4:5, where God had said, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. It was partially fulfilled in the coming of John the Baptist. It will be fully fulfilled through the Elijah ministry of the church in the last days, preparing the church for the second coming of Christ. And when they came back to the disciples, verse 14, they saw a large crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. And immediately when the entire crowd saw Jesus, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son, possessed with a spirit which makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it dashes him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. And I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it." And he answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And there we see the disciples to whom Jesus had given authority over demons, unable to cast out the spirit. We read very clearly that when Jesus sent out the 12 disciples whom he named apostles, we read of it in Matthew chapter 10, that one of the authorities that he had given to them was to cast out demons. Matthew 10:8, he gave them authority to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. They had that authority, but it's possible for the Lord to give us something and yet for us not to experience it because of our own lack of faith. Nothing is automatic. In the Old Testament we read that God told the Israelites in Egypt, the elders of those Israelites, that he would take them to Canaan, yet not one of those elders saw Canaan's land because of their unbelief. So God's promises can be nullified through our unbelief. Unbelief ties the hands of Almighty God. And that's what we see here, that even though Jesus had given his disciples authority over demons, yet we read that they could not cast out this demon when this child possessed with a demon was brought to them. And Jesus made it clear as to the reason. He included his disciples in that statement, "O unbelieving generation." The disciples too were an unbelieving generation. We see here how Jesus publicly rebuked his disciples. He didn't hesitate to do that where they needed that strong rebuke to be challenged to a greater faith. They did not get offended. Many are offended when they are publicly corrected. That is because they love their own reputation more than sanctification. A person who is interested in his sanctification more than his reputation will not be offended even by public rebuke. He will only be interested in further sanctification in his life. Jesus rebuked them publicly, saying, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when he saw Jesus, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling about and foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often thrown him both into the fire, into the water, to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." The father said to Jesus, "If you can do anything." But Jesus replied in verse 23 saying, "If you can." The responsibility was on the Father. All things are possible to him who believes. If the Father could believe, then God's power would be effective on behalf of his child. And this is a very interesting passage that teaches us, as parents, we can exercise faith in matters of physical healing on behalf of our children. We can't exercise faith for our children's salvation, to bring them to salvation. We can pray for them. But when it concerns physical healing, the Father's faith can bring healing to the child. That's what we see here. If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Everything is possible. Immediately the boy's father cried out. He said, I do believe, help me in my unbelief. He did not claim to have great faith, but he said, Lord, with the little I have, I want to trust you. Please help my unbelief. And that honesty Jesus appreciated. And that little mustard seed of faith was enough. And Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit in saying to it, You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again. And after crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out. And the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and raised him, and he got up. And here we see something, that the demon threw him to the ground, verse 20, but Jesus raised him up. Jesus never throws anybody to the ground when he prays for him or lays hands on him. It's demons who throw people to the ground. Jesus always raises people up. There is a habit among some to be excited when they see somebody thrown to the ground. Remember, it is demons who throw people to the ground. Jesus always raises people up. And verse 28 we read, when Jesus came into the house, the disciples questioned him privately, why is it we could not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot come out by anything but by prayer, and as we read in some other versions, and fasting. Prayer and fasting have a value in preparing our heart to have faith, to trust God, so that his promises can be fulfilled in our lives.